Got a fun one for you today. Now, I've seen this gentleman on the right, whose name is Andrew, on clips of the Whatever podcast. I don't know too much about him, except that he calls himself a blood sport debater. I respect that. He does something deliciously ironic in this particular video, which I find common when listening to sectarian religious people go down what I'm going to call in air quotes the doctrinal scale, sliding down the scale. I'll expound a little bit on that in this video, but it's probably going to require its own video to explain in detail. The goal here is to demonstrate how Andrew commits the exact same sin that he accuses Lauren of. So let's go through the short video and I'll demonstrate where he goes sideways while gratuitously pummeling Lauren Chen. This might get a little spicy.
And all I see is people on your side completely going after these red pill podcasters and people like this. And yes, it's true. Many of them are degenerates, but that doesn't make them less right about what's going on and the fact that the Christ pillars offer no prescriptions to marriage at all. They offer nothing.
I don't think that's fair to say they offer no prescriptions for marriage at all.
Well then, okay, Lauren, why should a secularist man get married? Give me one good reason.
Well, one good question is why shouldn't he? Good reasons. One, it's one of the first mandates of God in Scripture. It's ordained of God. It's like asking why you would want a secularist to obey the 10 Commandments or implement the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount or attend church regularly. Like, why not? I figured out as we go where this question's coming from, so I'll get to that. But doing anything God has commanded you to do will bring you closer to God and will yield better results than disobedience. No matter what your beliefs are, no matter what denomination you are, God honors commitment. If we draw near unto him, he will draw near unto us. Let's see what Lauren said. One good reason.
Well, I think that having children is a very good and very important one.
Why should a secular man want children? Why would you want a secular man to have children?
Because marriage and having children is part of the Lord's pattern for sanctification, and it's modeled after the heavenly patriarchy. This is something, Andrew, I've heard him talk a lot about, the patriarchy in Christian ethics. But in this video, for some reason, he kind of leaves that angle out of his approach. It also makes men better citizens, statistically, better in pretty much every way.
As I mean, aside from the general decline in birth rates, which I think is a
you want secularists to continue to reproduce? That seems like a good idea to you?
Again, a little weird. What's the alternative? If a secularist doesn't reproduce, what are they going to do instead? What's the trade-off? Are they just going to focus on running for higher office and then get to decide how I raise my kids? We don't want them to have any skin in the game, shared concern for the rising generation, unity of purpose, none of that? Not so much?
Yes, I think even if you are not Christian, you probably should have kids. We're at a point.
Is their marriage valid if it's a secularist marriage to begin with, Lauren?
Valid? No.
No. So then you're basically telling them to sin, right, Lauren? Aren't you telling them to sin by telling them to get a non-Christian marriage and have children? Aren't you telling them to sin, Lauren?
Now we're getting somewhere. So I didn't hear any premise before this clip that made marriage a sin or what his argument was. But I assume it has something to do with marriage outside of the church because I've learned that he's Orthodox. So let's see where this goes.
Okay, this is, yeah.
What's that? Yes? Yes, you're telling,
Yeah,
so you're telling people to sin, Lauren? That's your prescription? The whole time you've been beating the holy hell out of the red pillars? And the entire time they've been right? And you've been telling them to sin, Lauren?
So hang on, let's
answer the question, Lauren.
I'm happy to admit where I'm wrong. This is not a problem for me. Let's talk about this. So, do you believe that it is sinful for a man to get married and have kids if he is not a Christian?
That's not marriage. Marriage is a sacrament between a man and a woman. That's
okay, so now we're kind of enlightened as to why he's hitting the sin thing so hard. I can see this point of view if you're Catholic or Orthodox, because they see marriage as a holy sacrament, right? So that's where the sinning aspect comes in. But if you're Protestant, I mean, can you see it from her point of view? It's a little misguided. I want to read a comment here that someone left to try to elaborate on what Andrew's position is. If you get married as a non-believer and then enter the marriage and continue to sin, it is defiling the sacrament. Well, Andrew's saying the marriage itself is a sin. The Holy Union. That was his broader point. Two people sinning who get married and continue to sin does nothing for marriage as a concept, nor is it something that God would see as pleasing unless both individuals actually put forth the effort to uphold their vows. But this is me interjecting. If they got married, that is the vow they're upholding. So we're saying that's continuing to sin. Either way. And live within the demarcations of the sacrament, even if they are unaware of them. Otherwise, it's, as he said, just a civil union of sinners living under the banner of marriage. While he was aggressive, he was definitely trying to get Lauren to understand what she was convincing people to do and how she was actually ultimately leading people astray. End quote. I know I interrupted there, but to me, it's the same problem that Andrew has, is he's making a contradiction in the argument, saying that two people sinning who get married continue to sin unless both individuals actually put forth the effort to uphold their vows. Well, the marriage is a vow, so how are they still sinning even if they're putting out the effort? Let's talk about sin. I wish at this point Lauren had attacked that part of the argument. Saying that she's encouraging them to sin, we have to talk about what that means. Sin has a result that's proportional to the sin itself. So sin, the word, actually means missing the mark. You can miss by a little, you can miss by a lot, or you can shoot completely in the wrong direction. Calling all those sin doesn't imply anything about the degree or severity, and therefore the punishment, result, consequence, etc. I would say, Andrew, how would God punish you for getting married and having kids if you aren't a member of a church? Furthermore, how would God punish you if you got married in a church that isn't the Orthodox Church? Which church is it? How are the punishments different? What is the penalty for missing this mark? Will you become more of a secularist? Will you contract a disease or some kind of spiritual regression? A hotter part of secularist hell is reserved for you? She should have really pushed back and asked about the specific results of sinning, because we know the temporal results of getting married. We know the statistical benefits of it. We know the sanctifying effect, maturing, progressive effect it has on men to help them grow up, get the crusties out of their eyes, and start taking life seriously. All good things, because those all come with commitment, especially when the commitment is ordained of God. But why, Andrew, do the Father, the Son, Peter, Paul, and others inspired in Scripture advocate for marriage instead of saying, do it only if you want to not be an unbeliever and a grave sinner? That distinction is never made. So this is something that might just be particular to Orthodox, might be Catholic. I'm curious if you're Orthodox, what your thoughts are, because I have a lot of respect for the belief system, but I think you missed the mark here. Let's hear her answer, and then I'll chime back in.
Marriage is a sacrament between a man and a woman. That's within the purview of the Christian ethic. You have been running around with the rest of the tradcons telling men to sin, Lauren. Why are you doing that? Why? Now answer my question. Why are you doing that, Lauren?
Well, I think you're illustrating something, and again, you're getting upset with me here, but I'm happy to hear if I'm wrong, and we can talk about this. But I mean, it is true. I have argued for like a civil marriage, even within, if you're going to have kids as a man, even if you're not religious, cohabitation does not have the same outcomes as a civil marriage. That is true. There is still a difference between.
And it's all sinful, right, Lauren?
Yes, I think that.
Then why are you advocating that people sin? Answer my question.
Again, this is my issue with wokists and leftists. There's no nuance.
I guess I would. That's true. That's true. I guess my argument should be first for people to.
And now you know why I think you're a feminist, Lauren. Now you know.
Because of the marriage thing?
Because you go out of your way. You haven't thought these positions. The problem is when you lift these positions from people and you haven't actually thought about them, you end up being at the mercy of them. The reason I engage so much with these red pillars, the reason I engage so much with them, so that I actually understand their positions. The reason that I engage so much with the Christian sphere is so that I can really understand the positions. You don't have a good understanding or grasp on these positions. And it's covert feminism. What ends up happening ultimately, because you haven't thought these through, is you end up advocating for things like this, which are literally sinful, and you don't even know you're advocating for them.
No, I think you're right on and I will cede that. But I think when it comes to like the voting thing, I don't think it's fair to say that I haven't considered it. I think this is a good illustration of you're right here when it comes to advocating for secular marriage. I think I can simultaneously acknowledge that a secular marriage still has better outcomes for those involved and any children involved than something like cohabitation.
Oh, you're a Christian. You're not a consequentialist. You're not looking for outcomes. You're not looking for outcomes.
Recognize sorry, let me finish. But then also recognize that.
So here's where we get in the weeds a little bit. So here, for her to say it's better that a secularist union results in marriage for the kids than that it doesn't. He goes, no, it's sinning. It's all sinning. I'm like, but she's right. It is better. He kind of allayed that argument. So now we've come back to this where he says, you're not a consequentialist. I agree. Outcomes are important. That's what she's talking about. She's speaking in the language of outcomes, right? Degrees. There's good, better, and there's best. Andrew's going the Sith route. Everything's an absolute. If you're not doing it exactly this way, it's a sin. Therefore, it shouldn't be done at all. I think that's the vibe I'm getting here. Am I wrong? So let's talk about outcomes. Now, Jesus Christ knew that most of the disciples were not savvy enough to understand doctrine. So he provided means, and we can see this when they asked him, hey, why do you speak in parables? He goes, well, pretty simple. To some it is given to know the mysteries of God, and to some it is not given. Does that mean some are not as deserving? Does this an equity conversation? Does this mean some people are predestined to know and some not? No, it means some people don't want to know the answer. Some people are not willing to put in the work to get the results. Some people don't put a priority on that information and therefore will never understand it. So why saddle them with the additional accountability and liability and potential condemnation of that information if it's of no benefit to them? It's an act of mercy. So in this case, for those who are not savvy enough to understand doctrine, Christ provided a simple means. He called it, by their fruits you shall know them. We can get into the weeds. We can go down the rabbit hole. We can parse every single word and translate it into 3 different languages and talk about the context, or I can make it as simple as it can possibly be. By their fruits you shall know them. This is consequentialism. Or, he that does the will of my Father will know if the doctrine comes from him or if I speak of myself. Consequentialism. Those are the 2 best examples. And that one in John 7:17 is one of the most fantastic examples of it, because the Pharisees and Sadducees were accusing him of blasphemy, accusing him of teaching false doctrine, accusing him of elevating himself to the status of the Son of God, which they eventually killed him for. And his response was not to debate them, but to say, look, do it, live it. See if the consequence doesn't tell you the truth of what I'm saying. And he says there's 2 options. One, you'll know if the doctrine is from he that sent me or if I speak of myself. So simple, so easy. Consequentialism. Christianity is consequentialism. It's cause and effect. The only way a Christian would claim it isn't a form of Christianity. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say the only reason a Christian would claim it's consequentialism and then ignore the results is if their form of Christianity doesn't generate the promised blessings, doesn't generate the outcomes and the blessings that Christ has promised, doesn't generate the fruits of the covenant and the fruits of belief and the fruits of repentance and the fruits of the Spirit that lead people to say, I know this is true. I absolutely believe Christ when he promises these things because I've seen him in my life. Right after I finished watching this clip, originally, I left this comment, and this is the fun part of the video where people's heads in the comments explode. This is funny when you're LDS, as I am, and believe the biblical version of marriage, which is never designed to end. It's modern, i.e. woke Christianity, which teaches the unbiblical idea of till death do us part. On a larger scale, Andrew is guilty of the same crime as Lauren. This is why Christ said things like, with the judgment you judge, you shall also be judged. So, what I want to point out when I mentioned going down the doctrinal scale is you can always look to the person to the left of you, if they're atheist or unbeliever, and say, here's all the reasons what you're doing is wrong, because I have this doctrine, this belief, this understanding that you don't have. The danger of this is if you look to your right and someone understands it better or has more information or doctrine, they go, yeah, buddy, but same for you. And I'm going to do more videos on this as we go forward because it's a fascinating concept. If you don't believe in consequentialism and you do believe in till death do us part, then how is it different from a secular marriage? Definitionally, it's the same. Stick with me. If it happens in a church, the marriage, and the pastor, priest, whomever declares the same outcome as those simply with powers vested in themselves by the state of fill in the blank, then of course, consequentialism is the argument, because the ecclesiastical authority and the state authority have no meaningful distinctions. What benefits does the ecclesiastical authority grant in a marriage if you can't identify what's different about it, then how is it a sin aside from being declared a sin? It doesn't make sense. Like, what I mean by that is most of the time someone's sinning, you can say, well, it's a sin. Well, why? Why is it a sin? I don't believe you. What's your authority? Why do you say that? You can point to several reasons why it's obvious, pragmatically, objectively. In reality, here's all the reasons why you shouldn't do it. Whether you agree it's a sin or not, here's some obvious consequential things that point to this not being good, not being something Christ would advocate, not being something Christ wants his children to do. You see this with a lot of political debates. I won't go into them. You know what they are. Let's go to the issue of it being a sacrament. Calling it a sacrament certainly raises the stakes, right? It raises it in holiness, in esteem, in importance. But ordinances of Jesus Christ were special because they were binding, not just in life, but in death. Everything he did was meant to extend beyond the grave. When you're baptized with the proper authority, does death nullify the baptism? If it does, then why does it matter if you do it or not? Now, the consequential argument would be someone who does it is going to make an effort to honor that commitment that they made to God, and God in turn will honor them as they do so. But the baptismal covenant, the promise, is only good if it's done with that authority. So in this, I agree with Andrew. So let's go back to marriage. Is a secular or civil marriage recognized as a sacrament in the church? No. In practice, is it given the same promise of duration? Yes. By contrast, being a member of the restored gospel and possessing the sealing power that the Lord promised to Malachi that would be returned by Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and vice versa, all ordinances, including marriages and family relationships, i.e. patriarchy, can and will be preserved beyond death. If patriarchy, as I've heard Andrew say, is the design of God for his people and families, then why is it for life only? Christ was sent here so that death would have no victory, no sting. Why does this only apply to our brief blink of an eye mortality and not to the greatest joys that can be accomplished during this life so that they can extend into eternity? Is this not far more consistent with Christ's teaching in Matthew regarding divorce, that it was permitted only because of the hardness of hearts? But in the beginning, it was not so. That's such a great line. In the beginning, it was not so. It didn't exist. And if it didn't exist, when did people start assuming that marriage ended at death? I know you're thinking to yourself, there's that one example that we misquote in Matthew and misinterpret where God says the person who asked the question greatly errs and doesn't understand the power of God. But all the rest of them point the other direction. Is it not far more consistent with Paul's teaching that man is not without the woman and woman not without the man in the Lord? Those are the three most important words of that verse. They are not separated in the Lord. It doesn't say tomorrow. It doesn't say till death. It doesn't say anything because it's not meant to end. Is it not more consistent with the Lord's decree that man and woman shall be one flesh? No expiration date. Is it not far more consistent with Christ's teaching that what God hath joined together, let no man put asunder till death do us part? That's the default setting. Every marriage is put asunder by the authority that's vested in the person doing it when they say, until death do you part. Is it not far more consistent with Paul's admonition that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man at any time the things which God hath prepared for them that love him? So why do we always assume too little instead of too much? Is it not more consistent with the understanding of even the corrupt and malevolent Jews who would kill their own Savior that marriage did exist in heaven? They understood it better then than modern Christians do today, which is why I often refer to it as common core Christianity, because it was decided by consensus what could stay and what could go. My point, of course, is that we are going to call secular marriage a sin, as Andrew does, because it mimics the ordinance of marriage as sanctioned by God. That Andrew should be prepared for the possibility that he also is living in sin if his version and understanding of marriage misses the mark of what God intended at full scale when he instituted marriage. Andrew's argument that seculars should not get married is foolish. All the stats and all the fruit point the other direction. And arguing that it's a sin without getting evidence of why it's sinful, aside from the decree that outside of the church marriage is sinful, seems foolish to me, absent the discussion of marriage existing beyond this life, which is what the ecclesiastical authority was for. In summary, I would have loved to have been there to say, Andrew, what's the difference between a valid marriage and an invalid marriage? Not just in the short term, but in the long term. You cannot take this life seriously until you start to take the next life seriously. This conversation would be a lot different if someone said, here is what marriage is supposed to be. Here is the ideal. Here is the highest order of marriage. And here are the results that come with that. Now, falling short of this is not a sin by any means. In fact, the closer you get to it, the happier, more fulfilled, and closer to God you'll be. But alas, it is far easier to politically red pill someone than to spiritually red pill them. And the gospel of Jesus Christ and the atonement are only as big as people allow them to be.
This is the way.